Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days. I want to actually go ahead and do a motherboard review of one of the first I got my hands on, the newest, one of the chipsets for the newest AMD Ryzen CPU. So this one's actually a B650 Tomahawk with Wi-Fi from MSI. I've actually been really looking forward to actually getting my hands on this. Motherboards actually have been selling out a little bit more than the processors this time. Processors are actually available, but not just available, even the cost of it has actually been swiped down a little bit, which is pretty good. But motherboards, especially the higher tier ones, is more mid-tier over here, have been a little difficult to get your hands on. But regardless, I was able to get my hands on this and look forward to more motherboard reviews as well too. So let's go ahead, pop this open, take a look at the motherboard, get it installed, and do a quick walkthrough of the BIOS as well too. So let's go. Really excited actually to get this open and get everything installed. But before we do that, as usual, let's go ahead and take a look at the box itself. You see the whole full name on the front there. Nice little picture and some diagram of all the features this motherboard actually has here. Connected a lot with the chipset, the B650 chipset over here, and does actually have Wi-Fi. Additionally, it does have a little picture of the all the inputs in the back and the rear of the computer, which is really useful. I actually do not see that this has PS2 ports here. It does have your HDMI display port, your 2.5 LAN, and a bunch of USB ports there, and there's your USB-C port. Wi-Fi connection for the antennas over here, and the audio connections over here as well too, including an optical out as well. And some other little features it does mention here as well. There's your chipset, the PCI Express slots, generation 4, generation 4 for the NVMe slots, the M2 slots here as well. All the speeds, all the USB ports in the back as well too. Your LAN port, which is 2.5 gigabits LAN from Realtek, and some other little features here. AMD Wi-Fi, that's pretty interesting. Bluetooth 5.2. All that good stuff for DIMM slots, obviously, as you can see here. And there is your AM5 socket right there. This motherboard does support DDR5, as all, I believe, all these generation AMD motherboards actually support only DDR5 in this case. And a little bit of look at the front cover again. So let's go ahead and get this open. Looks like it has the box within the box, somewhat flimsy little box here, but there you go. Let's go ahead and move out the motherboard out of the way for the time being. And very interesting enough, one little thing I did miss in the back, and I'll go ahead and show you just before I jump into that. Looks like a couple little stickers here, cable layers, labels and whatnot here. Quick installation guide, regulatory notice, okay. Here of course are your little Wi-Fi antennas, and one SATA cable with a couple of M2 screws and locks over here. Now, one little thing I wanted to mention in the back cover, you do notice that inside the box there was something missing that is always traditional. Very simple. The user manual actually was not printed and included in this box, but they do actually have a little QR code back here that you can scan. And will give you access to download probably a PDF version of the user manual, or even interactive page-by-page user manual. So that's pretty much it here for the stuff in the box. So I'm going to throw this back here. Let's go ahead and unbag the motherboard itself. Here's the motherboard itself. Obviously, the one big feature and change from previous generations of AMD motherboards and whatnot from the AM4 socket is obviously now we do have this different socket over here where basically the CPUs are now pinless, and all the pins are actually on the motherboard, very similar to what Intel's been doing for some years now, I would say. And I've been wondering when AMD is actually going to be switching to this kind of design here. There's definitely plus and minuses about it. Obviously, if you bend pins on the CPU is damaged. You bend pins on the motherboard can be damaged. There are obviously cases where we have CPUs more expensive than motherboards, and of course very overpriced, I'm not going to say overpriced, but very high-end motherboards this will definitely surpass the cost of a CPU. So bending pins is definitely a big no-go and no bueno for anybody. So let's go ahead and take a look at this motherboard over here. I did actually mention it just a little bit earlier, but I want to go ahead over it again now to actually have the unit outside of its static bag. You can actually see here, if your Ryzen CPU is going to have integrated graphics on it, you'll be able to actually use these HDMI and DisplayPort port back here, and you're not using a dedicated video card on your PCI Express slot. You do additionally have a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port over here. This has actually become a pretty good standard these days, as routers are beginning to support it as well too. So, you know, much higher data transfers. There's even motherboards that have 10 gigabits, but 2.5 is definitely becoming a good standard over here. Here we have actually a couple of USB 3 ports. Right over here, there's 2. Looks like there's another 4 over here in the blue color. These actually might be USB 2.0 ports, because I actually do see the label here. It does not actually say the super speed, the SS over here. So very interesting that they actually still include USB 2 ports, if those indeed actually are. Another USB 3 port and one USB-C. I'm actually kind of thinking why they actually didn't include another USB-C port over here, but you know, it is what it is. And you actually do see that connection right there. Additionally, a little bit more to the right, you do have the 2 connections for your Wi-Fi antennas if you plan to actually use Wi-Fi. Bear in mind that the Bluetooth actually uses these antennas as well too. So if you only plan to use Bluetooth and you actually go into the BIOS and disable the Wi-Fi connection, which I usually do on basically desktop motherboards, you'll still need to actually go ahead and connect those antennas to actually take full advantage of the Bluetooth device as well too. Over here we do have our little audio connections, the red representing the front or stereo 2-channel speakers, and everything else being your microphone, and also additional channels as well too. I believe this actually has 8 channels available. Down here we do have a little optical connection for optical audio connections if you like to actually go ahead and use that as well. I did actually miss one little thing over here. Looks like we do have a little flash BIOS button. So when more generations of firmware for the flash BIOS actually comes out, you do actually have the option to flash this motherboard and update the BIOS without the presence of memory or CPU. So that's pretty interesting. You basically just have to connect a USB thumb drive, which I believe is going to be actually in this port specifically over here. Press this button and just follow the instructions in the manual, and you can basically flash this thing literally with nothing connected. So very interesting and very useful. Many generations ago, we'd actually have a new generation CPU on an older generation motherboard, which does support it, but without a flash and new generation of the BIOS, which can become a little bit of an issue if you don't have a CPU. As always, let's go ahead and take a look at various connections and basically features that this mother actually has based on its connections over here. Down on the bottom left, we actually do see a front panel connection for audio. Basically, if you actually use a dedicated sound card, it probably has this connection as well too. So you can go ahead and connect basically a headphone jack and a microphone jack on the front panel of the computer. If you actually still use one and actually have one, you can actually go ahead and connect that connection right over here. Very old-fashioned traditional connection here. Just to the right of it, this little 4-pin connection looks like a little RGB connection for basically just colors, lights, RGB lights on fans, and other little decorations you might have on the case as well too. These next 2 connections over here, one of them actually appears to be some sort of tuning controller, which I believe is this little 5-pin right over here. I'm not 100% sure what this little connection is here with 3 pins. I actually did take a little browse at the manual, and it doesn't really describe it too much, but this one I believe, or one of the 2, definitely is some sort of tuning module that's very optional. You can go ahead and plug that in here if you plan to use that. Over here, one of these 2 connections here has to do with the chassis intrusion. It isn't actually well basically labeled here like it previously was in other MSI based motherboards, but I believe one of these 2 connections, or both together, are basically for chassis intrusion, something that's not really used on home build, custom build computers, maybe on branded computers, or basically just let you know that the computer has been opened or something was removed and whatnot, if you actually do want to use that. I've actually never used one myself. The manual also doesn't really mention too much about this 5-pin connection here. It's definitely not a Thunderbolt connection, that's for sure, even though JT kind of might give you that inclination. To the right, you actually do have 2 system fan connections over here. Both of them are 4-pin. I believe most fan connections are now 4-pin. 3-pin is really just a little bit older, but still can be used right over here if you actually see 3-pin right there, and just add the additional 4-pin as well. Further to the right, we actually have two old-fashioned USB 2.0 connections, usually used for front panel or rear panel connections, mostly for front panel. Now, USB 3, USB-C are basically just taking over, so USB 2 is really not being used. I do know some Corsair power supplies actually have connections for these, basically just to monitor voltage and fan speed and everything else. So if you actually do have a connection for that, this is definitely very useful to you, but personally I've not really used one myself. Further to the right, we have two SATA ports, two of the 6 that this motherboard actually has. Further to the right over here, looks like we actually do have your front panel connections, basically for your reset, power button, hard drive, activity light, and all that good stuff. This is something that still hasn't been standardized, but after doing so many builds and whatnot, I actually do have the configuration kind of memorized. You know, basically your bottom is your hard drive and reset button, and the top 4 ports is your power LED and the power switch button. Sometimes some people take a little flathead screwdriver to kind of short a little bit and just turn the computer on without actually having a button present, which is very useful in some cases. I did actually go ahead and skip over it a little bit, but if you actually see these two 4 pins over here, these two pins actually rather, adding up to 4, are actually very connected to the CMOS. Basically, one of them is to basically clear out the CMOS completely, and one of them is actually to boot up the BIOS in the motherboard in very default settings of your BIOS and CMOS settings right there. I forget which one is which, but if you actually put a little jumper here, you'll basically trigger with the feature for clearing CMOS or actually just booting up in default settings. Further to right here, we actually have this little 3-pin connection over here, which is yet another connection for LED lighting right over here. It's not really labeled too nicely, but you can actually see up here it says RGB. Basically these little 3 pins over here. Just make sure you connect the correct one. You might actually damage your LED strip or fan, whatever you plan to connect, if you actually do have the wrong configuration. And just before I move on, this really isn't used too much, but this 4-pin over here is basically an old-fashioned PC speaker. So when your computer turns on, you hear all the beeps and blips that we actually traditionally used to hear in 90s computers and early 2000 computers as well too. Not really used, but the option's there. Looking at the other side of the motherboard over here, while we move along, we see another 4-pin fan connection right over here. System fan. This one looks like it's labeled number 3. And over here we do have a USB 3.0 connector right over here. So it actually looks like this motherboard only has one of these, but don't fret, there's actually a USB-C connector further up front. I'll demonstrate that to you in literally a few seconds. So this is where you're actually going ahead and connect your blue USB 3 ports and 3.1 ports if you actually have them on the front, or even want to use this for the rear, which might be a little inconvenient considering it's facing the wrong direction. Moving a little bit more to the right, we do have the additional 4 out of 6 SATA ports. I'm actually a little surprised that this is actually even using so many ports, just because, well, to be honest, most of the stuff is really just using NVMe drives on M2 slots and not really so much SATA ports. Moving a little bit further to the right, we actually do see that front panel USB-C connection right over here, something that previous AMD motherboards, some of them at least from mid-range and whatnot, actually did not have. The X570S motherboards, which is basically a variant of the X570 chipset without a fan, basically all passive cooling. I guess that's what the S is for, silent. Actually did have these connections here available, which is a really nice add. So if you do have USB-C on the front, you can definitely go ahead and connect this, which is very, very useful. And a little bit further over here, we do have the traditional 24-pin power supply connection here for the motherboard itself. Sorry, just literally bumped into the camera there. And you can actually see that here. This actually has not changed for many, many years. It previously was a 20-pin connection, but now it's 24. No new standard for this, and I guess it's just going to remain like that for some time. A little bit further to the right, we actually do see an additional 4-pin fan connection. Sorry, let me go ahead and move this here. You can actually see that here. And a little bit further up, you can actually see where it says debug LED. We do see these little 4 LED lights, which is hardly visible, but they definitely do tell you the status if there's any particular failure during post regarding to memory, video card, CPU, etc., and basically all the lights will turn off when the computer is ready to boot up and you actually see video on your screen. All right, over here, we actually do have the DDR5 slots. There's 4 of them here, using them in dual channel. So if you're going to be using them in dual channel, be sure to use the correct configuration, as I'm basically opening these up right here, just to remind myself where those chips are going to go. Up here on the top of the motherboard, looks like we do have another RGB connection. This one's a 4-pin one. These are becoming much more popular and appearing more and more on motherboards these days, as people like to decorate their cases with strips and other whatnot settings and features basically there. A little bit further to the right, we do have 2 additional system fan connections. Actually, one of them is a system, and one of them is actually a pump fan connection. Feel free to use it as a system fan if you'd like, but this is basically if you're using water cooling and you want to go ahead and connect that fan or that basically the pump detector right over here, so it can give you accurate results there. A little bit further up here, you can actually see here, slightly ever so slightly blurry, is your CPU fan connection, and that's basically for air cooling right over here. It's not the end of the world if you do connect fans into the wrong port, but you might actually have an issue. Your computer may actually think it's overheating, or the CPU has no cooling, and the fans are probably just going to knock up to maximum speed to compensate when it really just doesn't have to. Over here further to the right, it looks like we actually do have this big heat sink right over here covering some stuff underneath. I'm actually trying to take a peek if I can see what. If anything, maybe it's just here for looks. You actually do see the MAG logo right up here. Very, very nice. Very pretty solid as well too. Moving on a little bit further to the right, we actually do see 2 8-pin power connections for CPU power. Now basically, this generation of Ryzen CPUs, as far as I know, there's no lower wattage, 65 wattage at this time. Everything's like 90 or 105 minimum, and even some hitting 170. That number may actually increase as new processors get released on this particular generation and socket AM5 of AMD CPUs. So I can definitely see why they would include 2 of these. Sometimes some motherboards from previous generations only had 1, or they had 1 8-pin and 1 4-pin. So now 2 8-pins definitely makes sense, especially if you're going to overclock these CPUs and draw much more power and wattage to the basically the processor and to the motherboard. So just to make sure you actually have enough to power it up. And basically just turn a little bit more to the right, we get back to the connectors from the I/O plate, and this I/O plate very nicely is built in to the motherboard itself, so you don't have to have a separate back plate, I/O plate that you can occasionally just forget to install and have an issue when you have to take everything off. Otherwise, basically the rear of your motherboard is going to look a little bit naked, and that doesn't look very nice on any build whatsoever. Over here we have 2 PCI Express X16 slots. It looks like right over here, generation 4. Ideally, you'll be using this one here for video cards and whatnot. You do have your CMOS battery here, very old-fashioned as well too. Down here you also have, looks like, a PCI X1 slot as well. Additionally, you also have a couple of M2 slots, which I'm definitely going to cover a little bit more when I do the build, and actually remove these so you can actually take a look. We have one over here. We have an additional one down here, and an additional one right over here as well too. These heat sinks actually have been proven to be quite useful through my personal experience. There was actually an opinion that they actually do kind of give a little bit more of a heat issue to NVMe drives that are installed, and cause an issue for throttling, further throttling and whatnot. Good news is you can also remove these if you choose not to use them, or you actually have your own built-in heatsink on the NVMe drive, which is pretty useful. Some of the NVMe drives actually come in with them already pre-installed. I know Samsung has them, and they're very useful just to avoid throttling and speed downs of those really fast generation 4 NVMe drives. Just before I go ahead and get started with the build, I actually want to go ahead and take a look at the AM5 socket for one of the first times. Let's go ahead and remove this protective cover. This is actually pretty traditional. Intel motherboards definitely have these, and I definitely don't blame AMD for installing these as well too, just to protect the pins. And this comes off pretty easily. Sometimes you can even install the CPU, and then once you close the lid, the plastic will just be pushed out, and there is your AM5 socket with several, dozens and hundreds of pins down here as well. It's basically your AM5 socket. Obviously, you don't want to bend these. That would be a big issue, and even if you change the CPU, your motherboard probably wouldn't even boot up or post, and that would be a big problem right over here. So let's go ahead and pop in the CPU, some memory, a heatsink, toss in the video card, toss this whole thing into a case, and get the build going. Hope you enjoyed that little build process right there. Looks like our system is up and running at a whopping 4.7 gigahertz for this little 6-core CPU, newest generation of Ryzen processors. If you're enjoying the video so far, go ahead and shoot that like button and also go ahead and subscribe for more updates. I definitely will be doing some more motherboard reviews, installations, and builds as well too, so definitely look forward to that. And you'll be notified very quickly if you actually go ahead and hit that little ding as well too when a new video is uploaded. So here we are. Looks like we are up and running over here. And actually, when the system actually did originally boot up, it did actually show me this particular view here, which I can call the easy mode view in MSI systems. So let's go over a couple little features here and there, give you a little bit of a thorough in-depth view of the actual BIOS of this motherboard itself. Very similar to other MSI motherboard BIOS and whatnot. And you can actually see this particular BIOS build date is fairly recent, in September, only just about a couple of months old, literally. And pretty sure I actually did go ahead and check MSI's website, and there is actually a new version of firmware, so I'll go ahead and do that update as well too. So you can actually see here that we are running at 4.7 gigahertz right now. Pretty whopping speed. DDR5 speeds running at 4800 megahertz. I actually have not changed that. If you actually do have faster memory, you can go ahead and manually change it, or just go ahead and turn on the XMP option and pick a profile there that's actually built into your memory as well. Here basically you can actually see some basic CPU information, your clock speed, your ratio, which is a whopping 47, core number, which is a 6-core CPU here, voltage, and some other options here as well too. Go ahead and click on the next button. You'll go ahead and see the memory here. I'm actually using Crucial Technology memory here, both 8 gigabytes each chip, for a total of 16 gigabytes here. Now you might be thinking 16 gigabytes is semi-low, but mind you, this is only for build and testing purposes. I definitely do have more memory being used for an actual build. Speaking of XMP profiles, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually see there is one built in to this particular memory chips here. You can actually see it'll be running at 4800 megahertz, which actually this memory is running at. Moving along here, once we click on the next button, we'll see some options for storage, where basically you have a rundown of all the devices that are currently connected, storage-based devices on your motherboard. I actually only did go ahead and plug in a regular SATA hard drive, SSD. You can actually see it here. It's a Samsung 850 Pro, 256 gigabytes. I'm just going to be using that for testing purposes. You can actually see during the build process, I did not actually put an M2 NVMe chip inside the motherboard, but definitely have been using them for many of my builds and family builds as well too. Those hard drives really do make a difference. Continuing here, we do see some information on fan control and all the numbers and temperature, as well as up here all the way on the top, which I'll go over in a moment. You can actually see CPU core temperatures at a whopping 57 degrees Celsius. I am actually using a stock cooler just for this purpose, and you can actually see that the CPU is actually running at a higher speed than usual, than it's actually really meant to, or just basically just pushing a single clock speed even while you're in the BIOS, which actually may explain for the higher temperature. You can actually go ahead and change that, and I'll demonstrate that to you in a little while. Over here, you can actually go ahead and click on individual fans and see their speeds and whatnot. You also do have the option to manipulate them as well. You'll see some options here: system temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, and of course the current RPM here as well too. There's actually another option here too, so you can have more in-depth control of all your fans. That's in the hardware monitor, and I'll go over that in just a moment. Under the help button, looks like we have some little F keys here to actually go ahead and jump into a particular feature, or save and reset your settings, save and load, etc, etc. So all these little buttons are actually available for you here. On the bottom, looks like we do have a little button here for M-Flash. I'm not going to go ahead and click on that because it'll actually go ahead and take me to the option to engage in M-Flash and actually reboot the computer, and then go ahead and enter that setting there. Under favorites, looks like we can actually go ahead and set up some favorite hotkeys manually here as well too. Just go ahead and click on one and set up one for exactly the function you need it to be. Hardware monitor is the one I just mentioned before. Basically, you have full control here between the temperature of your basically what you're trying to control here, and also the RPM. So you do have that graph here that's actually very useful, and I've always found this tool here very useful here when I want to go ahead and enter some manual profiles. You can also go ahead and leave it as smart fan, but if you go ahead and click on each one, you'll see that you can actually go ahead and manipulate each one here as well too in the voltage, and you'll see that the fan speed begins to just increase as you change it, or decrease as well too. Something to keep in mind if you actually want to go ahead and control certain fans on the front, on the back, or even on the top, and just make things a little less noisy or a little bit more powerful if needs be. Over to the right, we do actually have a couple of little options here. Looks like FT and PM is actually enabled. I can go ahead and turn that off just by clicking it over here and dragging it over. There you go. Some other options here as well too, the onboard audio controller, easy LED control, and some other options here as well too, which you can definitely have more better control in the advanced mode up here. Jumping up to the top of the screen, we obviously do have the current time and date. Obviously the date and time are completely wrong. It says January 1st, 2022, but that's to be expected here. Go ahead and enter that manually, or once entered manually or automatically once you install your operating system. CPU temperature, DDR speed, we have here. Looks like over here we do have the option to turn on options for game boost on the CPU, or go ahead and click on which XMP profile you want to go ahead and select. In this case, we only have one built in on my memory, as I mentioned earlier, and that's basically right over here. Further to the right to that, we actually do have the current CPU temperature still around 57 degrees Celsius, still a little high just considering I'm in the BIOS. Motherboard temperature at around 40 degrees, 39 degrees Celsius, voltage, your current BIOS mode, and the full name of your motherboard, CPU, your memory size, and your current BIOS state and build date as well too. Very useful information. Just below, we actually do have the boot priority, which you can actually move around and actually change at your leisure. Very easy to actually manipulate, even though there's actually another method to actually go ahead and change these around, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate to you in just a moment. That's pretty much it for the easy mode here. Actually very basic settings that you really just need just to get the computer up and running and boot it up and whatnot. So let's go ahead and switch over to advanced and take a look at some other options we actually do have there. You actually can't see if you're familiar with MSI motherboards, a very basic information you have here, and all the options, basically your settings, OC, M flash button, and everything else on the right side as well too. On the top, we actually do have the same options as we did in easy mode, basically all your basic information, CPU DDR4, options for XMP, and your boot devices as well too. Further up, we do have the option to switch back to easy mode. We also do have an option to actually do a screenshot. I believe if you hit the F12 key and you have a thumb drive saved, plugged into your computer, you can actually go ahead and save that file onto the thumb drive as well too. You have some options here to go to search for a particular option here, and also change the language here. Currently we're using English at the moment. So let's go ahead and cover as much as we possibly can here. We're going to go ahead and click on the settings button here. We actually do have some options. We do see here system status. We go ahead and click on that. See some more thorough and in-depth information here of all the connections here, your date and time, and current system date. Very similar to what I actually see on the top. So nothing new really here for the most part. Going to advanced, we actually see some further options here, such as ACPI settings, integrated preferables. If you want to go ahead and click on this, you actually do have the option to turn off certain devices. In this case, I actually am not really a big fan of using Wi-Fi on desktops unless you really actually need it. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off. There's some other options here to go ahead and turn off disable LAN controller, and also turn certain SATA ports into hot plug mode if you choose to do so. Here's your sound card as well too. Integrated graphics connection. If you are actually using a CPU with integrated graphics, you can go ahead and enable or disable that here as you wish. USB configuration, go ahead and click on that if you want to actually go ahead and enable or disable legacy mode, and other options as well too. Power management setting, you can actually see all those options here as well too. BIOS CSM, UEFI, a little difficult to say sometimes. You can actually go ahead and change that depending on which boot mode you prefer to use. Some other options here like wake up event setting, secure erase, which is a very interesting option if you actually do have an SSD plugged in. I'm going to go ahead and click on no here in this case. And some other options as well too, MSI DUI support, and S Media SATA. Down here we do have the option for AMD overclocking. I believe this system actually does it for you, so obviously it is warning you if you do want to accept that. Bear in mind, any sort of overclocking can be a risk, so just be really careful. If you don't know what you're doing, I do not recommend you go ahead and attempt to overclock. Even the smallest bit, you may actually go ahead and damage your hardware by overvoltage, doing the voltage overvolting it, or overclocking it too much to the point that you burn out your CPU or damage your motherboard. That's pretty much it for the settings option. Under the advanced section, go ahead and click on boot. You actually do have some options here to manually select your boot order. This actually is a little bit more useful. You can, as soon as you click on each one, you'll see all the options here available. Now, since boot mode is currently set to UEFI, I actually do not have legacy boot mode options, but if we jump back into the option that we had earlier, right over here, you actually do see we now have the options for legacy, but obviously we can go ahead and change that right back there as well too if you want to. We have some other options here, basically full screen logo display, post beep, and obviously your boot menu here. Go ahead and click on whichever device you want to go ahead and boot off of. In this case, I'm going to be installing a fresh copy of Windows 11. Feel free to install Windows 10 as well too, whichever you prefer. So I'm going to go ahead and select a USB key as a main boot device here as well too. Everything else you can go ahead and disable if you choose to do so. Under security, it looks like we do have some options to set an administrator password on the BIOS if you want to go ahead and set that up. UKey, another little option we have here. Trusted computing, something very interesting and useful since it was actually a requirement for Windows 11 installations if you haven't modified your installation, and all your options are here as well too. Chassis intrusion, as I mentioned on doing the motherboard overview, there is that little plug there. You can go ahead and plug in a little piece of hardware for chassis intrusion if you choose to do so. At this point, it's currently disabled since I actually do not have anything plugged in. And some options here for secure boot as well too if you have your hard drive plugged in and you want to prevent the machine from booting up from an unauthorized boot device such as a CD or a thumb drive. And last but not least, looks like we do have the option to save and exit. Once you go ahead and click here, you can save all the settings you've changed, or actually just go ahead and just leave the BIOS with and abandoning all the changes you've actually made. Moving on to OC for overclocking, we can actually see here we do have some options. We do have an Explorer mode, put to Expert or to Normal. Some options are probably not visible in Normal mode, so if you want to see those, go ahead and click on the Expert mode here. Here we have very interesting option, CPU ratio apply mode. Basically apply the same ratio to all the cores, which is very interesting. Obviously we have the current ratio here is at 47 times 100, so we're going to actually see a 4700 megahertz CPU. Go ahead and click on advanced CPU configuration. You do see some additional options here. Going ahead to AMD overclocking, we do actually see all these options here as well too. Precision boost override as well, which is currently disabled at this time. AMD CBS, we have some further options here for overclocking, such as core performance boost. I actually usually turn this off just because it really drives up the temperature from time to time, even when just not doing anything. But this is basically your overclocking option right here, which does boost the CPU past the current number here, 4800 megahertz. And that's something you can actually see in Task Manager when you're in Windows. Some of the options down here as well too. We have further options here for CPU. Again, do not make any changes if you do not really know what you're doing. Even just triggering something that will cause the machine not to post and boot up, will just basically have to force you to reset the CMOS and reset all your BIOS settings as well too. Moving down here, I'll just try to go over this real quick. We do actually see a bunch of DRAM settings here. You can manually go ahead and select your DRAM frequency. At this point, 4800 is the speed I'm actually looking for, but if your memory is not at the speed that you want it for, go ahead and manually select it here as well. Just down here, we do have some other options, as I said earlier, for voltage, for the CPU, and the memory itself. So again, do not make any changes to these if you really do not know what you're doing. That's pretty much it for the options here in overclocking. I'm not going to go over it too much. Just below, we actually have some CPU specs. You can actually go ahead and see that there. And memory Z as well too, if you want to go ahead and apply certain overclocking settings specifically to these memory chips. Flash obviously is the option to go into Flash and update the BIOS, and I'll try to cover that very shortly. OC profile, if you actually do have a lot of overclocking profiles here, you want to go ahead and set those up and save them, or even save them to a USB, or even import them as well too from a USB thumb drive. You do have that option here. Very useful if you're actually going to be doing specific overclocking profiles for specific reasons and for specific tasks as well too. Hardware monitor, which is basically the same setting I just mentioned earlier. You can actually see the CPU fan speed has actually gone up, just as the CPU temperature has gone up as well too. And beta runner, very interesting. This is actually an option I did not see. Looks like we do have some options here, such as SSD self-test for NVMe drives. Go ahead and click on that. I'm just taking a look. And obviously, since the hard drive I have plugged in here is not in the NVMe, this actually will not work here, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on exit. And another option here as well too, you can actually see the description here on the right. Alright, so after we went ahead and clicked on the M-Flash button, the computer asked me to reboot. It rebooted and it actually brought us into this little screen right over here. So I'm going to go ahead and update and flash the BIOS here. I do have a USB thumb drive. If you didn't have one plugged in, it will actually warn you that there's nothing plugged in. You can go ahead and plug in your thumb drive and hit the little refresh or retry button, and poof, here we are. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Go ahead and click on this little directory and this file. And you'll see here that the current model numbers match, version number is different, and build date is actually from October, so maybe just a little less than a month over the generic release that this motherboard actually came with. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. It should have asked me, do I want to go ahead and update this? And off we go. Alright, it looks like it actually rebooted itself a number of times, or actually just reposted and posted and posted about 4 or 5 times. So the whole firmware update process actually took about, I would say about 2 to 3 minutes, and then maybe a little bit more. And then just basically getting back up on its feet and getting back into the BIOS took about another minute or so. But you can actually see here the BIOS build date is now in October, newer version and whatnot. Everything seems to be pretty much the same, probably just a little bit of fixes and whatnot, nothing too significant. But if you ever do have an issue, your BIOS update is definitely a good way to actually get a lot of things resolved. Just go ahead and check out MSI's site and see what their particular version of BIOS update is actually offering with that version. Before I go ahead and get an operating system installed here, you can actually see one big difference here. CPU core temperature now dropped to a whopping 48 degrees Celsius, a good 10 degrees Celsius, which is actually very significant after I went ahead and updated the BIOS firmware on this particular motherboard. So seems like we actually did see a pretty big difference here. Now mind you, earlier when I was going over the settings here, I did actually demonstrate that this particular option up in CPU configuration were actually off. You can actually see here core performance was disabled, And jumping back in here again, we actually do see that the precision boost overdrive was also disabled. Now, for whatever reason, the temperature of the CPU was actually still pretty, pretty high, 60 degrees Celsius, which without any actual overclocking is pretty significant. And looks like this BIOS update may have actually done a little bit of a trick there and actually corrected that little error. So definitely something to look into if you actually do see any issues with just overclocking and whatnot. Maybe having the latest BIOS update, BIOS firmware version is a really good idea. Just be very careful though. Obviously that's a really good way to brick your motherboard if you do something silly. You actually did see here when I was doing the firmware update, it did actually lock the keyboard and mouse, so I won't go ahead and do anything. But yanking the plug during a firmware update is a big mistake. And there's definitely ways to go ahead and repair your motherboard, but back in the old day, it's basically saying sayonara to your motherboard, and sometimes even manufacturers will not be pleased to actually go ahead and replace it. Here's your basic Windows 11 installation. I'm just going to go ahead and go through this and see how everything goes. Alright, looks like we are up and running with the installation of Windows 11 right over here. I would say the whole installation probably took about 5 or 6 minutes with all the boot ups and whatnot and restarts. Well, actually, there's only one, but it almost felt like maybe 2 or 3. But here we are. Let's go ahead and open up Task Manager. I'll just take a look at a couple little options here, and go ahead and turn this on here as well too. You can obviously see there's 6 cores, 6 threads, total of 12, running around 4 to 4.2 gigahertz, occasionally dropping a little lower or a little bit higher. So very interesting speed. Running over 4 gigahertz is actually very astonishing on the CPU, but mind you, this I believe this is actually the lowest of the newest generation of Ryzen CPUs, 7600X 6 core, is hitting temperatures of around 40 to 50 degrees Celsius, even just running, just basically doing nothing. But hitting 4 to 4.5 gigahertz is actually very amazing. We actually did see probably was even going higher at the turbo speeds earlier, which I went ahead and shut the option off just so the CPU cooler could just run a little cooler in general, being that it's running only on their stock cooler. So I definitely do recommend, if you do actually get your hands on this generation of Ryzen CPUs, definitely do not use a stock cooler. I'm only using it just for demonstration purposes here, but if you're going to be doing anything like gaming or actual workload, you will definitely feel the hits and throttling effects of a cooler. It's just not really going to keep up. But here, the installation went off without a hitch. You actually do see some really wonderful things here. And I'm not going to be running benchmarks and whatnot at this point, because this review is really more focused on the motherboard itself. But if you have any questions regarding CPUs and whatnot, or the hardware I actually used for this, by all means, let me know. I'll definitely be putting all the specs in the description below. Before I go ahead and end the video, just as always, just get a little bit of a close-up of the motherboard here in action. Actually see, this motherboard really doesn't have too much in terms of LED lighting. I think there's some on the top. My memory chips actually do not have any LED lighting, and of course you do see LED lighting coming from the CPU heatsink. You might have actually also noticed that I did not actually connect the 4-pin connector to control the colors on the LED heatsink on this particular model. I just left it out for the time being because I really just wasn't planning to change the colors at this point anyway. So you can actually see here right now, I'm just doing the random colors. This particular heatsink actually has a lot of colors on the fan area itself, and also a different configuration for the lighting around the circular part of the fan as well. So it doesn't look like there's really too much LED lighting on it. But even really, now that I went ahead and changed those settings and updated the BIOS as well too, it's actually running pretty cool. Earlier when I was actually going through the motherboard overview, the CPU fan was actually throttling up to, as you notice, probably 2000 RPM and getting ever so slightly noisy to a degree. Now it's actually running pretty quiet, even though I'm still booted in Windows 11. Not doing anything, but definitely not hitting temperatures of 60-65 degrees Celsius, which is actually just nuts, especially just running at stock. Anyway, hope everyone enjoyed this video, the build, the overview, and everything else. If you have any questions, let me know. Definitely shoot a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Go ahead and hit that little bell and the subscribe button, because I definitely will be doing more motherboard reviews for Ryzen's latest chipsets. Thanks again for watching, and as always, everyone, stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.